Imagine being married to someone you trust completely, someone you believe would never harm you. Now imagine that same person, the one you thought you knew, secretly plotting your murder. For years, Margaret Rudin played the role of the devoted wife, the concerned widow. But behind her tears and pleading for her husband's safe return, she was hiding a deadly secret. A secret so carefully crafted that it fooled everyone, even the FBI. Ron Rudin was a successful businessman in Las Vegas, known for his charm, his wealth, and his generosity. He was the kind of man who seemed to have it all. But in December of 1994, Ron vanished without a trace. The case quickly became one of the most baffling mysteries in the city's history. As the investigation unfolded, no one could have predicted the shocking truth that lay beneath the surface. How did Margaret, a woman who seemed to be grieving, manage to keep her husband's murder hidden for so long? What was it that allowed her to manipulate those around her, turning suspicion away from herself and making everyone believe she was the victim? Tonight, we explore the chilling tale of Margaret Rudin, the wife who fooled everyone, even the experts. What did it take for a woman to orchestrate such a cold, calculated crime? And how did she evade justice for so many years? Before we dive into the dark web of deceit and murder, it's essential to understand the woman at the center of it all, Margaret Rudin. Margaret was born in 1943 in Detroit, Michigan. She grew up in a modest household, far from the glamour and luxury that would later define her life. From an early age, Margaret exhibited a certain charm and ability to win people over with her charisma. But those closest to her would later reveal a more complex side, a woman who was often manipulative, calculating, and willing to do anything to secure the life she dreamed of. In the 1970s, Margaret moved to Las Vegas, where the neon lights of the Strip beckoned to anyone looking to make their fortune. It was here that she met Ron Rudin. Ron was an experienced businessman with deep ties to the city's thriving casino industry. He was tall, well-dressed, and wealthy, a man with an air of success that immediately set him apart. The two met at a casino, and it wasn't long before their relationship blossomed into marriage. For Margaret, this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. Ron Rudin was a man who at first glance seemed to have it all. As a casino executive, his wealth afforded him a lifestyle of luxury that many only dreamed of. But despite his public persona, Ron was known to be a private man, somewhat reserved and somewhat suspicious of the people around him. His cautious nature, however, didn't seem to stop him from trusting Margaret completely. Margaret and Ron lived in a grand 8,000-square-foot home in a quiet, upscale neighborhood of Las Vegas. The house was everything you might imagine a couple of their wealth and status would possess. Marble floors, expensive art on the walls, and a state-of-the-art kitchen. They frequently hosted parties where the city's elite would gather in their home to network, entertain, and share stories of their lavish lives. To the outside world, the Rudins were the perfect couple. Ron was the successful businessman, and Margaret, with her poise and beauty, was the gracious wife. They were regulars at social events, and their marriage seemed like a fairy tale to those who only saw the surface. But as with many tales of wealth and appearances, the truth was far more complicated. Behind closed doors, however, the Rudin household was far from perfect. Margaret, despite her public charm, had a volatile temper. She was known to have frequent arguments with Ron, particularly over money, the lavish lifestyle, and her mounting debts. Though Ron tried to be patient, he couldn't help but feel that Margaret's extravagant spending was growing out of control. Still, he remained loyal to her, often making concessions to avoid conflict. As their relationship progressed, Margaret began to feel increasingly entitled to a life of luxury, one that she believed was owed to her, one way or another. Her desire to maintain this lifestyle grew stronger with every passing year, but so did the cracks in her marriage. As the tension mounted, Margaret became more desperate for control, and in her mind, Ron was the one obstacle preventing her from achieving the life she wanted. Ron, for his part, had his suspicions. He knew Margaret had a tendency to live beyond their means. He knew she spent excessively and that there were issues of trust between them. But he didn't fully understand the extent of her resentment until it was too late. In the years leading up to his disappearance, Ron had started to make plans for a life without Margaret. growing increasingly frustrated with their relationship. But Margaret had no intention of letting him go. By the time she'd concocted her deadly plan, she had already set the stage for what would be one of the most shocking and intricate crimes in Las Vegas history. To the public, they were inseparable, but the story that was about to unfold would reveal a far different reality, one where Margaret Rudin's calculated actions would leave a trail of lies, manipulation, and murder. And for years, she would succeed in hiding the truth from everyone who should have seen the warning signs. On the night of December 18, 1994, Ron Rudin vanished from his home without a trace. To the outside world, his disappearance seemed sudden, inexplicable. But for those who would later investigate his death, the night would mark the beginning of a case that would span years, leaving more questions than answers. It was just another night in the Rudin household, or so it seemed. Ron was last seen by his wife Margaret around 10 p.m., a seemingly normal evening in their sprawling home. Margaret would later tell investigators that she had gone to bed early that night, leaving Ron in the den to watch television. She claimed she didn't hear anything unusual, and by the time she woke up the next morning, Ron was gone. Margaret quickly realized that Ron was not just absent, he was missing. She checked the house thoroughly, but he wasn't anywhere. No sign of struggle, no broken windows, nothing to indicate foul play. She called the police, portraying herself as a concerned wife, desperate to find out where her husband had gone. When law enforcement arrived at the Rudin home, they were greeted by a distraught Margaret, who told them that she had no idea where Ron had gone. She explained that it wasn't unusual for him to go on business trips without notifying her, but something in her demeanor left the authorities feeling uneasy. Still, without any concrete evidence, they had no reason to suspect foul play just yet. At first, investigators theorized that Ron had simply walked away from his life, perhaps tired of his marriage, or seeking a new life far from the trappings of wealth and status. But that theory seemed less likely as time went on. No one had seen him leave, and there was no trace of his whereabouts. The case went cold. But despite the lack of evidence, Margaret played her part well. She cooperated with the authorities, seemingly distraught over the disappearance of her husband. She made numerous public appeals for help, expressing her fear that something terrible had happened to Ron. But behind closed doors, Margaret was hiding a different truth, a truth that would take years to uncover. In the days that followed, Margaret's story remained unchanged. She would tell investigators that Ron must have left on his own accord, and that she had no idea where he could have gone. She also revealed that Ron had been in the process of selling his businesses, which seemed like an odd move for a man who had seemingly vanished into thin air. But the more investigators delved into Ron's life, the more they began to see cracks in Margaret's story. There was no evidence of a financial crisis, and Ron's friends and colleagues described him as someone who would never abandon his family or his career. No one believed that Ron would just walk away from everything he had worked so hard for. As the investigation continued, the FBI became involved. They found no evidence of Ron's disappearance that pointed to a voluntary exit, no credit card transactions, no phone calls, and no sign of Ron at any of the places he frequented. The case began to take on an increasingly mysterious tone. As law enforcement questioned more people in Ron's life, they started to uncover more inconsistencies in Margaret's story. Despite Margaret's repeated claims that she did not know Ron's whereabouts, law enforcement remained skeptical. Margaret's story didn't seem to match up with the evidence they had, or more accurately, the lack of evidence. They soon discovered that she was being less than forthcoming about her personal life with Ron, leading them to start questioning her role in his sudden disappearance. Margaret's own behavior began to raise red flags. Friends of the Rudins reported that after Ron's disappearance, she seemed more focused on her finances than on finding her husband. She began to liquidate assets, sell off property, and take control of Ron's business ventures. It seemed as if she was preparing for a future without him, one where she would have the luxury and wealth she had always desired. Investigators now had two paths to follow. Was Margaret truly just a grieving wife who had lost her husband in a mysterious disappearance, or had she orchestrated something far more sinister? The longer the investigation dragged on, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to shift, revealing a picture that no one could have predicted. For the authorities, this was no longer a simple missing persons case. Each new development only deepened the mystery, and Margaret's version of events was beginning to unravel. The first sign that something was amiss came when investigators started comparing Margaret's statements to the evidence they had gathered. They had questioned her multiple times, but there was always something off about the way she answered. Too rehearsed, too perfect, as if she had been practicing a script. One day she'd claimed that Ron had left for a trip. The next day she'd mention a conversation that they had, a conversation that no one could verify. Margaret's inconsistencies became more apparent with each passing day. Her initial statements seemed too convenient. She painted a picture of a man who had grown distant and tired of his life. But the more investigators dug into Ron's personal affairs, the less that theory seemed to hold up. Ron had been a successful businessman, the owner of a number of casinos in Las Vegas. There was no evidence to suggest that he had been having an affair or planning to leave his wife. His colleagues and friends painted a different picture of Ron, one of a hard-working, devoted family man who had no reason to abandon everything he had built. Ron's life insurance policy raised a chilling question. Could Margaret have been motivated by money to orchestrate her husband's disappearance? As detectives started to connect the dots, the financial motive seemed too clear to ignore. Margaret had long been known to struggle with finances. Her spending habits were lavish, and her debts had started to mount. But with the life insurance policy, everything began to make sense. It was around this time that the investigation took a darker turn. Investigators began to suspect that Ron's disappearance wasn't as innocent as it had seemed. The evidence of a financial motive was clear, but they still lacked the critical piece that would connect Margaret directly to the crime. Months passed, and the case seemed to stall. But in 1995, nearly a year after Ron's disappearance, a crucial breakthrough came when a hiker in the Nevada desert stumbled upon something that would change everything: human remains. At first, they weren't sure whose they were, but as forensic experts examined the remains, they found enough evidence to confirm that they belonged to Ron Rudin. Forensic evidence would later confirm the shocking truth. Ron Rudin had been murdered. The remains found in the desert showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, a clear indication that Ron had not simply disappeared. He had been killed. The murder had been planned, and Ron's body had been left to decompose in the desert, far from home and far from any possibility of finding justice. Forensic analysis confirmed the identity of the remains, linking them unmistakably to Ron Rudin. But what was even more telling was the way the body had been disposed of, hidden in the remote desert, far from any signs of civilization. The location was carefully chosen, a place that seemed to offer no clues, no connection to anyone who could have witnessed the crime. It was a calculated move to ensure Ron's death would remain a mystery, buried in the vastness of the desert. The discovery of Ron's remains gave the case a new urgency. The FBI had been involved from the beginning, but now they had a body and they had a motive. The investigation would soon shift from questioning to arresting, and the truth, no longer buried in the desert, would begin to surface piece by piece until the shocking reality of what Margaret had done became clear. As the investigation unfolded, Margaret's carefully crafted facade would begin to crumble. The authorities were no longer just chasing down a missing person. They were closing in on the mastermind behind one of the most devious and calculated crimes Las Vegas had ever seen. As the investigation began to gain momentum, Margaret Rudin was far from cooperating. She wasn't just playing the part of a grieving widow. She was manipulating everyone around her, carefully crafting a narrative that would shield her from suspicion and keep her out of the authorities' grasp. But her ability to maintain the facade of innocence was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. In the weeks following Ron's disappearance, Margaret's grief appeared genuine. She spoke to the press, held a memorial service, and even participated in interviews where she portrayed herself as a devastated wife, desperate for her husband to return. Her public persona as a victim of circumstance seemed almost convincing, too convincing for those closest to her to believe otherwise. But those closest to her would later recall subtle inconsistencies in her behavior. Margaret was never as distraught as one would expect of a woman whose husband had mysteriously vanished. In private, she was cold, calculating, and surprisingly composed, far from the emotionally wrecked widow she portrayed in front of the public. But in front of the cameras and her circle of friends, she was the picture of innocence, masterfully evading suspicion and aligning herself with those who could confirm her story. While law enforcement slowly began to piece together the evidence, Margaret was already ahead of them. The woman they thought was a grieving spouse was, in fact, the mastermind of a calculated crime, manipulating the narrative to fit her needs. She played the role of the helpless widow to perfection, even as her life became more complicated with each passing day. As Margaret's financial issues became more apparent, her motive was clearer than ever. But something else loomed in the background, her ability to control the narrative. She had expertly manipulated her friends, her family, and even the police into thinking she was a victim of circumstance. But when the investigation took a turn, when her lies were about to unravel, Margaret made a bold decision. Instead of facing the consequences of her actions, she chose to flee. In 1995, with the investigation closing in on her, Margaret made a life-altering decision. She would vanish. Using a series of aliases, she slipped out of Las Vegas without leaving a trace. She had been planning this moment for months, and the perfect opportunity had finally arrived. Authorities would soon realize that the woman they were after was no longer in the city. She had disappeared, and they had no idea where she had gone. Margaret's escape was a carefully orchestrated plan. She dyed her hair, changed her appearance, and assumed a new identity. She blended into the crowds in Mexico, living under the radar, evading authorities for years. Despite her best efforts to remain hidden, investigators would later discover that she continued to live off the money from her late husband's life insurance policy, a constant reminder of the crime she had committed. For more than a decade, Margaret stayed one step ahead of the law. She moved between cities, never staying in one place for too long, always changing her appearance and her identity. It wasn't until 2005, a full decade after Ron's murder, that authorities finally managed to track her down. We knew she had to be somewhere. But the hardest part was getting a lead. She was smart, too smart for us at first. She'd left no trace, no digital footprint to follow. But we never gave up. And that relentless pursuit paid off. In the early 2000s, after years of dead ends and false leads, a breakthrough finally came when Margaret was spotted in a small town in Texas under a new name. The long search was over. But before they could arrest her, Margaret would take one final desperate step to evade capture. Just when investigators thought they had her cornered, Margaret vanished once more. This was a woman who would not give up without a fight. The chase was on again, but this time, the authorities were ready. They would not stop until she was found. Years had passed since Margaret Rudin slipped through the cracks of law enforcement's grasp, but the passage of time hadn't dulled the memory of Ron Rudin's disappearance, or the sense of injustice that had followed it. Then, in the early 2000s, everything changed. Advancements in forensic technology began to revolutionize criminal investigations, and cases that had gone cold for years were being re-examined. The search for Ron Rudin's killer was no different. With new techniques in DNA analysis and improved fingerprint matching, the investigation was revived. In 2001, investigators decided to revisit a piece of evidence that had been overlooked before, a small fragment of clothing found near the location where Ron's remains were discovered. Advances in forensic science allowed the team to extract DNA from the clothing, and this new evidence, combined with a series of other breakthroughs, eventually led them to a shocking revelation. It was the break they had been waiting for, Margaret Rudin's DNA. The woman who had evaded capture for over a decade was finally identified as the person who had murdered her husband. But even with this new evidence, the chase was far from over. The authorities now had to locate her once again, this time for good. Margaret was living in a small town in Texas, where she had spent the last few years hiding in plain sight. But this time, the authorities had her cornered. There was no more escaping. On the morning of her capture, in the quiet town of El Paso, Texas, Margaret Rudin's life on the run ended abruptly. A team of federal agents and local law enforcement swarmed her modest apartment, arresting her without incident. The woman who had managed to outsmart the FBI, who had been playing a game of cat and mouse for over a decade, was finally in custody. Margaret was extradited to Las Vegas to face charges for the murder of her husband, Ron Rudin. The trial that followed was a spectacle, with cameras capturing every moment of this long-awaited legal drama. Her defense team would argue that there wasn't enough evidence to convict her beyond a reasonable doubt, but the prosecution had an overwhelming case. The prosecution's strategy was clear. Margaret had murdered Ron for his wealth, for his life insurance policy, and for the power his money gave her. The key evidence, the DNA match, the forensic analysis, and Margaret's own financial records, which painted a damning picture of a woman who would go to any lengths to secure her future. The defense, however, played on the idea that there were gaps in the prosecution's case, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that Margaret's flight could have been attributed to fear, not guilt. They painted a picture of a woman who had been traumatized by the sudden loss of her husband, struggling with her own emotions and decisions. Despite the defense's attempts to create doubt, the evidence was too strong. The jury deliberated for just under 3 days, but it was clear. The overwhelming evidence of Margaret's guilt could not be ignored. Guilty of murder. Margaret Rudin was convicted for the killing of her husband, Ron. It was a moment of vindication for Ron's family and a moment of justice for a case that had seemed unsolvable for so many years. After more than a decade of manipulation, deceit, and evasion, Margaret Rudin was finally held accountable for her crime. But the real question remained: how did someone so close to Ron, someone who shared his life, hide her true nature for so long? The jury's deliberation was a long, tense process. After hearing weeks of testimony, examining the evidence, and weighing the defense's arguments, the 12 jurors finally came to a unanimous decision. Margaret Rudin was guilty. Guilty of murder in the first degree, the judge declared. The courtroom was filled with a collective breath of relief as a long unsolved mystery had finally been laid to rest. Margaret's sentencing was scheduled soon after the verdict. The courtroom was once again packed with reporters, Ron's family, and law enforcement, who had dedicated years to bringing her to justice. In the aftermath of the conviction, the sentencing was swift. Margaret Rudin was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The judge's words were firm as they echoed through the courtroom, a final declaration of the justice that had eluded Ron for so long. The public reaction was immediate and intense. News outlets covered the trial extensively, with many expressing shock at how someone could carry out such a cold, calculated crime and maintain the appearance of a grieving wife for so long. Forensic experts also weighed in, noting how critical the advances in technology had been in this case. The breakthrough in DNA analysis, the identification of Margaret through that tiny scrap of clothing found near Ron's remains, had been the turning point. Without it, the case might still be sitting in the cold case files, another unsolved mystery. As the years pass, the case of Ron Rudin's murder continues to linger in the minds of those who followed it. The questions it raised about trust, deception, and the lengths to which people will go to hide their darkest secrets are not easily forgotten. Margaret Rudin's ability to weave such a tangled web, to maintain a facade of grief while hiding the truth from everyone around her, left a lasting impact on those who knew her and on the investigators who pursued her. Ron Rudin's family was left to reconcile the gap between the man they thought they knew and the woman they never saw coming. For them, the truth may have been more painful than the murder itself. The realization that someone so close to them, someone they trusted implicitly, could commit such a heinous act and cover it up for years. This case reminds us that even the most perfect facades can hide something dark beneath the surface. The trust we place in others can be shattered by the deceit of those closest to us, and the pursuit of justice, no matter how long it takes, is often a journey through pain and uncertainty. Margaret's ability to manipulate and deceive, not only Ron's family but the FBI and the community at large, speaks to the complexity of human nature. We often don't realize the lengths people will go to in order to keep their darkest secrets buried. The true horror lies not just in the crime itself, but in how easily the truth can be hidden from those who trust us most. Throughout this case, Ron's family held on to the hope that justice would eventually be served. And after over a decade of uncertainty and grief, they finally got their answer. But as the case closed, many were left to reflect on what justice really means. Was it the conviction that gave them peace, or was it the act of finally knowing the truth? The pursuit of justice may have been long and painful, but in the end, it was not just about putting a murderer behind bars. It was about giving a family the truth they deserved, about acknowledging the complexity of human relationships, and about ensuring that no one else could fall victim to the same deceit. As you reflect on this story, think about how easily trust can be broken and how deeply deception can run. How far would you go to hide the truth? What would you do to protect yourself? The answers to those questions may be darker than you expect. As we close this chapter of Margaret Rudin's dark and twisted story, we are reminded that truth is often harder to uncover than we think. If you found this case as gripping as we did, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the most chilling and mysterious true crime cases. And we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the case? Could law enforcement have caught Margaret sooner? How do you think her ability to deceive so many for so long impacted those who knew her? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this documentary, be sure to like the video, share it with friends, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Join us as we continue to explore the darkest corners of human nature and the pursuit of justice. Thank you for watching, and remember, the truth can be stranger and more dangerous than fiction. Subscribe for more true crime stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update.